The chandelier above my parents' dining table glittered like a crown, one they'd already decided I'd never wear. My name is Kate Emerson, and on that humid Savannah afternoon, my family gathered to fix my life. They thought I'd come crawling back to their legacy, begging for a place at their table. What they didn't know was that I already owned the building they worked in, and their empire was built on sand. When the truth broke, it didn't just change the markets. It changed me. Because sometimes the quietest one in the room holds all the power. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The envelope waited on my doormat like a marble tomb, heavy cream-colored, the return address pressed in gold, Emerson Estate. Inside, the paper smelled faintly of the cedar drawers where my mother kept her linens and disappointments. The handwriting, her slanted, perfect cursive, summoned me to an urgent family meeting, which in our house had always meant a verdict disguised as concern. I stood by the window, river light cutting a bright seam across my floor, and read it twice. The words were polite. The intention was not. I slipped the letter back into its sleeve, smoothed the crease, and felt the old ache rise up, a child's reflex, before it hardened into something steadier, something that belonged to the woman I've become. My apartment is small by Savannah standards, but it is mine, a clean square of quiet on the 11th floor, all glass and pale oak, a desk facing the river like a vow. The morning sun made a sheath of silver on the water barges sliding past with the patient dignity of things that know their direction. That's what I wanted when I left Emerson & Co. Not the mahogany corridors of legacy, not the portraits of frowning men whose wealth felt like a family heirloom I was expected to dust. I wanted a life I chose. The kettle clicked off. I poured coffee into a white mug with a hairline crack and thought about the last time I'd stood under my parents' chandelier, bracing myself while my father explained that loving me and trusting me were separate ledgers. The elevator mirror was unflinching. I adjusted the collar of my silk blouse, bone-white plain, the one my mother calls funeral fabric, and tied my hair back. Minimalist, she says, like it's a diagnosis. I say it's clarity. I've been coding inside that clarity for years, building Novacore from nights that bled into mornings from rejection emails I read out loud so they'd sting less. There's a part of me that still hopes, God help me, that walking through those iron gates will feel like walking home. But hope has a way of dressing up as a younger version of yourself, and I no longer wear that size. Traffic on Bay Street was light. Live oaks folded over the road like a cathedral, their green weight humming with cicadas. I drove with the windows cracked, the heat pressing in with the familiar sweetness of salt and grass. Savannah is a city that remembers. It holds on to its stories, even when they're inconvenient, especially then. As a kid, I thought the squares were game boards, and the statues were pieces you could move if you wanted it badly enough. Now I know better. Institutions pretend to be stone. The truth is, they're paper. Enough pressure, the right angle, and they fold. I turned onto the long drive of the Emerson estate and felt the world change temperature. The house is a Greek revival that never learned to laugh, columns too tall, lawn too manicured. Everything white and symmetrical, like a smile that's been rehearsed to the point of lifelessness. I parked beneath the magnolias, cut the engine, and listened to the cicadas again, because they were honest. Marble steps gleamed up to the doorway, the brass knocker a lion that always looks like it knows something you don't. The last time I climbed these steps, my father had just promoted my brother Daniel to CFO. He'd turned to me afterward, with that careful managerial kindness, and said, "You'll come back when the world teaches you your place." I'd nodded, then apprenticed to silence. "On the top step now, the air thick with gardenia," I whispered. I built my own place, and the lion seemed to approve. Inside my chest, anger and longing negotiated like hostile partners. I wanted to march in and read them a ledger they couldn't ignore. The burn rate, I tamed the patents, granted the peer-reviewed paper on our risk model, the first credit union we modernized in rural Georgia, where a farmer hugged me so hard I laughed into his shoulder. I also wanted impossibly to be met at the door by a mother who saw me before she evaluated me. American life teaches you to make your own road and praises you for it, but when you grow up inside a dynasty, the road is considered a threat unless it circles back to the front gate. I checked the time 10:30 and tucked the invitation into my portfolio. The leather was worn at the edge, where my thumb presses during tough calls. It smelled like meetings that mattered. My reflection in the car window looked steady enough. I had prepared for money conversations that could break a city block. I could handle a family meeting. Still, the ritual of it worked on me, the walk up the path, the hush of old trees, the memory of being 12 and counting the steps to the door because it helped my stomach settle. A life can be built on different foundations, cash flow code, custody of your own decisions, but the body remembers marble underfoot and does the math anyway. When I pushed through the wrought iron gate, the gardener paused and tipped his cap. Morning. Miss Kate. I hadn't been Miss Kate in years. Morning, Mr. Alvarez, I said. He'd taught me how to coil a hose without kinking it, how not to overwater hydrangeas, how everything that lasts needs measured care. Novacor runs on measurements like that. Quiet calibrations, small dials. The faith that incremental improvements can outmuscle loud promises. That's an American thing too, though we forget the patient neighborly work that keeps a place standing when the camera trucks leave. I crossed the portico, placed my palm on the cool brass, and let myself breathe, once a long, even inhale that I could ride through whatever came next. I'm 32. I sign paychecks. I meet with senators. I remember the server crashing at 3 a.m., and Eli, my COO, my co-conspirator in endurance, driving over with a bag of bagels and a joke so stupid I laughed and kept typing. I remember Daniel's graduation party where I poured wine like a waitress while men in cufflinks congratulated him for a deal I'd modeled. I remember my mother fastening a sapphire pendant at her throat and telling me blue softens a woman's face when she argues. I remember growing tired of being softened. At the threshold, I let the house's chill pass through me. The foyer is a cathedral to our surname oil portraits, a grandfather clock that only I know how to set a runner so clean you could eat off it if you weren't afraid of being exiled for life. The chandelier in the hallway throws constellations on the ceiling, gold stars for good behavior. I set my portfolio against my hip like a shield and studied the familiar imperfections, the hairline crack above the arch, the faint scuff on the baseboard where Daniel's hockey stick kissed it, and no one ever confessed. For all the polish the house had always told on us if you knew how to listen. My heels sounded sharp on the marble, too sharp for my mother's taste. She likes fright to arrive quietly wrapped in condolences. I paused at the mirror, framed in carved acanthus leaves, and studied the woman reflected back. Not pretty in the way society pages prefer, but precise. That's the word. Precise in posture, in the way I hold a gaze when someone tries to sell me an easy answer. There's a long American tradition of women being told that precision is aggression. I used to apologize for it. I don't anymore. I moved down the corridor toward the dining room, where these rituals always unfolded silver-polished to a mean shine. Water glasses the size of small aquariums, napkins folded like lilies you weren't allowed to crush. A child's memory flashed me, counting the diamonds on the cufflinks of the senior partners who came to dinner practicing my silence so well I could have been furniture. Another the day I asked my father what constituted real value, and he told me without irony that the market always knows. The market, I've learned, is made of people, and people are made of fear, and fear can be modeled and managed. That lesson should have belonged to my family story. They refused it. I learned it anyway. I stopped at the double doors, the wood cool and dark under my knuckles, and listened. China kissed China. A chair leg dragged an inch. My father's voice murmured something that flattened at the end, the way it does when he's decided, and is just arranging the words to sound like mercy. My pulse thudded once a hammer strike on steel that rang but did not bend. I thought of the river again, its constant forward. I thought of the code running right now on servers I could trace, like a nervous system across states, tiny lights blinking their consent. The life I built was humming while the life I left rehearsed its lines. A final look at the invitation urgent family meeting, and I felt a small, unexpected smile lift. Urgent for whom urgent in what century I had the absurd urge to slide the letter into a museum display, Artifacts of Control 1990, present. But the door handle turned from the inside and the museum vanished. The panels swung open on oiled hinges. My mother stood framed by the dining room's white glare, her pearls resting obediently at the hollow of her throat. Her lipstick a shade too bright for morning. Her smile was flawless and tired in the way a blade is tired. She took me in blouse portfolio posture, with the practiced sweep of a hostess evaluating table settings. The hydrangeas behind her were the same blue as the pendant she wore when she instructed me to be softer. She reached for my hands, not to hold them, but to position them where the photograph would look right. "We've decided it's time to help you fix your life," she said. Section 2. The Intervention. 1,000 words. The dining room looked exactly as I remembered, wide, sterile, and staged for judgment. Light filtered through the lace curtains in sharp, judgmental lines. The long mahogany table could have seated 12, but only 4 chairs were occupied, my father at the head, my mother to his right, Daniel to his left, and one empty at the far end for me like a witness chair in a courtroom. A porcelain pot of coffee steamed between crystal pitchers of water, and the air smelled faintly of lemon polish and control. My mother motioned to the seat at the far end. "You're late, darling," she said, voice wrapped in politeness that had always been a form of weaponry. My father's gaze was colder, steadier. He never wasted emotion. Daniel smirked behind his tumbler of orange juice, the kind of grin that said the verdict was already written. "Thank you for coming." My father began, folding his hands like a man opening a quarterly review. "We know how busy you are with— what was it again?" He glanced at Daniel. "Her app," Daniel said with a shrug, not bothering to hide the disdain. "Something about online wallets for college kids." "It's not an app," I said evenly. "It's a financial infrastructure platform for small businesses." "Of course," my mother said quickly, as if smoothing a wrinkle in the conversation. "And it's wonderful you've been keeping yourself occupied. But it's been, 3 years since you left Emerson & Co. "Surely it's time to come home," Daniel interrupted, finishing her sentence. "Dad and I have discussed it. We think you've learned what you needed to learn out there." I studied his reflection in the silver coffee pot, the same angular jaw, the same air of effortless entitlement that had followed him from prep school to the corner office. He'd never built anything. He inherited titles the way other people inherited freckles. My father cleared his throat. "Your mother and I have always believed in family unity. But lately," he paused as if searching for a diplomatic phrasing, "lately your choices have started to affect our standing." "Our standing," I repeated. He leaned forward, elbows resting on the tablecloth. "Investors talk, Kate. They see your name in tech circles and assume Emerson & Co. is diverting into unvetted ventures. It creates confusion. We can't have confusion attached to the family brand." "My company doesn't use your brand," I said, though. My pulse quickened. "I've been careful not to." "That's not the point," my mother said softly. "Perception is everything. People don't understand why you'd walk away from stability. They ask about you at the club. It's embarrassing not to have a clear answer. The club. Always the club. The same place that denied me full membership when I was 26 because I wasn't married or professionally affiliated. I almost laughed. They'd never known what to do with women who made their own money. Daniel drummed his fingers on the table. "Look, this isn't an ambush. It's a course correction. Dad's found you a position that'll help you get back on track. Position. He slid a folder toward me, embossed with the family crest. Inside was a neatly typed offer letter. Junior Analyst, Emerson and Co. I let out a slow breath. You're joking. My father's tone hardened. We're offering you an opportunity to rebuild your credibility. You'd report to Danielle for the first year, learn the systems properly, then maybe transition into portfolio management. We can't have you floating around unmoored. Unmoored, I repeated. That's what you call running a company with 87 employees and clients in 5 countries. My mother flinched, as if I'd said something vulgar. Kate, darling, you've had your fun, but it's time to think long term. Tech comes and goes, but family business, family legacy, that's permanent. I wanted to ask her if she'd ever considered that maybe permanence wasn't always virtue, that sometimes permanence was just stagnation with a marble facade. But I'd learned long ago that logic never moved this room. Only power did. Daniel leaned back confident. We even cleared a desk for you on the 10th floor. You start Monday. I stared at him, then at the clock above the fireplace. 10:03 a.m. In 1 hour and 57 minutes, the press release announcing Novacore's acquisition would go live. The timing was almost poetic. My phone vibrated in my lap, one short buzz. Eli. Press release ready. Final approval in. I slid it face down. My father was still talking, lecturing about structure, hierarchy, the importance of proving I could handle responsibility. His words blurred into background noise, a hum of old authority trying to fill a silence it didn't own anymore. He ended with Kate. We've been patient, but you're 32. It's time to join the real world. The real world, I said slowly, meeting his eyes. You mean the one where you measure success in dividends and family connections? The one Daniel said, where revenue matters more than retweets? I smiled faintly. Then I'm already ahead of you. That earned a pause. My father frowned, meaning, but I didn't answer. I picked up the folder, flipped it shut, and placed it gently in the center of the table. I appreciate the offer, I said. Truly. But I have obligations. Clients, investors, a company to run. A side project isn't a company, Daniel snapped. You don't even have a physical office. Actually, I said we do. Riverfront Tower, 23rd floor. My mother blinked. That's prime real estate, I finished for her. We moved in last year. A heavy silence spread across the table like spilled ink. My father's mouth tightened. You've become arrogant. No, I said softly. I've become competent. The old clock ticked behind him, patient, relentless. I could feel the tension pulling at the edges of the room, threads ready to snap. My mother broke first. Sweetheart, please. We're only trying to help. You've always been impulsive. We don't want you to make another mistake. Another mistake! The phrase hung there sharp and deliberate. I looked at her, at the woman who taught me how to curtsy and negotiate in the same breath, who once said being independent was admirable, but unbecoming if you wanted to be loved. I said, maybe this isn't about helping me. Maybe it's about you needing me, small enough to fit your story. She looked wounded, but she didn't deny it. My father rose from his chair, the signal that the verdict had been given. You can think about the offer, he said. Your desk will be waiting. I stood too, gathering my portfolio. My hands were steady, my voice calm. I won't need a desk. I already have one. Kate, Daniel said, his tone slicing through the quiet. Don't burn bridges you'll have to crawl back across. I met his eyes. Then I'll build my own. As I turned toward the door, my phone buzzed again. This time I didn't hide it. A notification lit up across the screen, Novacore Financial Systems. Press release scheduled for 12:30 p.m. Major acquisition announcement. I slipped it into my pocket and looked back at the three faces frozen in their own certainty. I should get going, I said. Some of us have meetings to lead. My mother's voice followed me down the hall, brittle and desperate. At least tell them you're considering it, Kate. They need your answer by tomorrow. I paused at the doorway, one hand on the knob, and allowed myself a small, deliberate smile. I'll have to decline, I said. I have a board meeting. My board. Then I stepped out into the sun, the sound of cicadas rising behind me like applause. Section 3. The breaking point, 4,000 words. The sun over Savannah had begun to tilt west, painting the estate's long driveway in ribbons of amber light. But inside the house, time stood still. I could still feel the weight of their words pressing into me, the thick silence that followed every condescending sentence, as if my father's authority were a law of nature and not a fragile relic of his own insecurity. I'd walked out of that room with their disbelief at my back, and yet the echo of it followed me all the way to my car, the same old rhythm I'd been hearing since I was 20. You're ambitious, Kate, but not practical. You're clever, but not built for risk. They didn't realize those sentences became bricks. I built with them. I sat in my car a moment longer, hands still on the steering wheel, and stared up through the windshield at the giant oaks that framed the property. The house, white and pristine, looked smaller now, like a monument to arrogance slowly fading in the light. I remembered being 15 and watching my father pour bourbon into his glass, as he explained to Daniel that the world was divided into leaders and followers. When I asked which one he thought I was, he said, "You're a dreamer, Katie. Dreamers don't lead, they distract." It had stung then, but I see it differently now. Dreamers are the ones who build what leaders are too afraid to imagine. My phone buzzed again. A message from Eli. "Everything's prepped. Newsroom standing by. You sure about the timing?" Exactly at noon, I typed back. Let it drop. The drive to Riverfront Tower took 12 minutes. I remember every light I hit, every stretch of road that blurred past. The closer I got to the city, the more the world sharpened. The stately houses gave way to new construction cranes arching like sentinels over glass and steel. My reflection glimmered faintly in the windshield, composed calculating, but underneath the pulse of something alive and electric. It wasn't revenge I felt, it was revelation. The lobby of Riverfront Tower gleamed when I entered. The marble floor reflected light so sharply it looked like a second sky. The receptionist, Nina, glanced up and grinned. "Morning, Ms. Emerson," she said, as if she hadn't just seen the breaking news alerts already beginning to crawl across her screen. "Morning," I said, stepping into the private elevator. The doors whispered shut. As the numbers climbed, I thought of every late night spent here. My team huddled around screens with coffee cups, the hum of servers like a heartbeat. Each floor passing beneath my feet felt like another mile away from the past. When the doors opened to the 23rd floor, Eli was waiting. His tie was loose, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and adrenaline. "We're live in 40 minutes, he said. Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg tech line, they're all running it. I took the tablet he handed me and skimmed the final draft. Nova Core Financial Systems acquires Meridian Bank for $7.8 billion. CEO Catherine Emerson leads the largest fintech merger in regional history. The headline didn't feel like triumph. It felt like truth finally catching up to time. Eli leaned on the edge of my desk. "They still don't know, do they?" I shook my head. "They'll find out with everyone else." He whistled softly. "That's going to sting." "They had their chance," I said. "I spent years asking for a seat at their table. They kept pretending I didn't exist, so I built my own." For a moment the office went quiet, except for the faint sound of the river below. I looked out at the skyline, the cranes, the bridges, the slow curl of the water. Savannah wasn't known for skyscrapers, but our tower was one tall enough to see beyond the historic district's pride and into what was coming next. At 11:59 a.m., I opened my laptop and pulled up the live press feed. Eli stood beside me. We didn't count down aloud, but when the clock on the screen blinked to 12, the press release went out. A cascade of notifications filled the dashboard. Within seconds, news alerts lit up across my phone like fireworks. The first was from Reuters breaking Novacor CEO Catherine Emerson announces record-breaking acquisition. The second from Forbes Savannah native reshapes the future of finance. My inbox exploded. Dozens of subject lines, interviews. Congratulations, partnership offers headlines from people who'd once ignored my emails. And then beneath them, 3 messages from my family's group chat. Mom, darling, seeing your name everywhere. Why didn't you tell us, Dad? What exactly have you done? This could create conflict with Emerson and Co. Daniel, unbelievable. You're sabotaging us. I stared at those messages for a long time before silencing the phone. I wasn't sabotaging them. I was saving myself. At 12:15, Eli handed me a folder. You'll need this for the presser. What is it? Talking points. And he hesitated. Also the valuation report. I flipped it open. The figure stared back at me, $2.4 billion, our current valuation before the acquisition boost. For a moment I just stared. Numbers are emotionless, but that one nearly took my breath away. It was everything I'd fought for distilled into proof. When I'd first left Emerson & Co., I had nothing but a used laptop and a rented workspace above a bakery that smelled perpetually of cinnamon and failure. I'd pitched 40 investors before one said yes. I'd learned to code at night, wearing gloves in winter because the heat was unreliable, and I'd sent emails to banks that never replied until one small credit union in North Carolina agreed to test our pilot software. I still remember the first transaction processed through our system, a $220 loan approval for a hardware store owner named Mr. Wallace. He'd called crying, saying our algorithms saved his business. That was the moment I knew I'd built something real. Those memories flickered through me now like an old reel. The exhaustion, the humiliation, the small wins that felt enormous because no one else saw them. Every night I spent doubting myself was now a brick in the empire they would finally have to acknowledge. The press conference began at Shonataro. Reporters filled the lobby downstairs, cameras already rolling. I walked toward the podium, the hum of voices washing over me like a tide. When the first flash went off, I didn't flinch. Good afternoon, I said. I'm Catherine Emerson, founder and CEO of Novacor Financial Systems. Today we're proud to announce the acquisition of Meridian Bank's digital division, marking a major step forward for decentralized finance and equitable access to banking. The words came smoothly. Years of watching my father control a room taught me that tone matters more than volume, but unlike him, I didn't need to dominate. I just needed to be undeniable. The applause came first from the back, then rippled forward. Questions followed flashes, the chaos of attention I used to beg for, and now found oddly calm within. Eli leaned in between questions. Check this out, he murmured, sliding his phone toward me. On the screen, a news ticker scrolled. Emerson & Co. stock drops 12% amid fintech disruption led by CEO Catherine Emerson. I felt a strange stillness in my chest, not satisfaction but closure. The world was simply rearranging itself according to merit the way it always should have. By mid-afternoon, we were back upstairs. The office buzzed with energy, employees hugging, calls coming in non-stop. I excused myself to the corner window, needing air. Outside, the Savannah River moved in its patient, unbothered way. I thought of my father's office with its framed diplomas and empire maps, the man who believed stability was the same as strength. I wondered if he was watching the news, realizing that strength sometimes looks like motion. At 3:00, my private line rang. Only 5 people had that number. I answered without thinking. Kate, my father's voice said, tight and clipped. We're hearing something about this merger. Tell me this isn't real. It's very real, I said. You understand the implications? Perfectly. This affects our markets, only if you refuse to adapt. A long silence, then a sharp exhale. You've made a spectacle of yourself. The family name is still Emerson, I said. I didn't change it. You just didn't recognize it when it stopped depending on you. He started to say something else, but I hung up. I wasn't being cruel. I was drawing a line that had always existed even when I'd been too scared to admit it. Eli appeared in the doorway a minute later. He's going to call again, I know. Do you want me to handle press inquiries from their side? Yes, I said, turning back to the window. Tell them I'm unavailable. For the foreseeable future. At 4:30, a news anchor's voice carried through the office TV. Breaking Nova Corps CEO, Catherine Emerson emerges as FinTech's quiet powerhouse. Emerson & Co. reportedly caught off guard by the record acquisition. The footage cut to an aerial view of Riverfront Tower. My team erupted in cheers. I managed a small smile. But later, alone in my office, I let the quiet sink in. It wasn't triumph I felt, it was something deeper, heavier, the realization that even victory carries grief. I'd wanted them to see me, and now they would, but not in the way I once hoped. Recognition built on ashes still burns. My phone lit again. This time it was my grandfather, William Emerson Sr. The name alone made my throat tighten. He was the original architect of Emerson & Co., the one person who'd taught me compound interest before I could drive. He'd retired years ago, but I could still hear his gravelly baritone reading stock prices from the newspaper at breakfast, explaining to me how every market cycle had a story behind it. I answered, "Hi, Grandpa." His voice was slow, deliberate. I saw the news. So the quiet one finally roared. I laughed softly. I didn't roar. I just stopped whispering. He chuckled. "You always did know how to bide your time. Your father never understood patience. He thinks power is noise." The warmth in his tone unraveled something in me. I just wanted to build something that mattered. "You did," he said. "Now make sure you remember who it's for." After the call, I sat there a while watching the last of the daylight spill across the city. For the first time in years, I felt both anchored and free. Then Eli knocked again. "You should see this," he said, flipping his laptop toward me. On the screen, Daniel was on CNBC. His expression was tight, performative calm. "Our sister's company," he was saying, "acted without consulting us. This is reckless and destabilizing for the financial community." "Of course," Eli said under his breath. "He's spinning it." I didn't look away. He always does. "Do you want me to respond?" "No," I said. "Let the results speak." The segment ended with a still frame of my face at the press podium, and beneath it the caption, "The future of finance is female." By the time evening settled, the office lights dimmed and the hum of computers softened into a steady lullaby. I poured a glass of water and looked out at the skyline again. The reflection in the glass caught my own silhouette, small against the window but solid, unshaken. I thought of that dining room, the gleaming table, the offer letter waiting like a trap disguised as love. They'd wanted to fold me back into their system, to clip the wings they couldn't see, had already hardened into armor. And somewhere inside me, between pride and sorrow, a truth formed, clean and bright. Sometimes family doesn't betray you by hating what you are. They betray you by pretending you're still who you were. I took one final look at the city, its lights flickering like circuitry, and whispered to the empty room, "They'll understand soon enough." At that exact moment, my computer chimed a breaking alert from Bloomberg. Novacor stock surges 40% post-acquisition. Emerson & Co. down 22%. Outside the river shimmered gold in the fading sun, endless and certain in its direction. The breaking point wasn't rage, it was clarity. And I had never felt more alive. Section 4. The Reckoning. 4,000 words. By the next morning, the city hummed with my name. The air itself felt charged, carrying fragments of conversations from boardrooms to breakfast tables. "Have you seen what she pulled off? A local, really?" Every notification on my phone was a headline. Every mention, another piece of proof that the empire I'd built in silence was now echoing louder than any of their legacies. And still, I knew the confrontation was coming. Family like mine didn't go quietly. They convened, they postured, they strategized. I was already preparing for the fallout when Eli appeared at my door, coffee in one hand, tablet in the other. "They've called an emergency meeting at Emerson and Co., he said. "Internal memo leaked. Your father's ordered a press statement. Daniel's spearheading it." I nodded. "Of course he is." Eli hesitated. "You could preempt it. Release your own narrative." "No," I said, standing to face the window. "Let them talk first. They've spent years defining me. I want the world to hear what they sound like without my silence to protect them." By 9, the feeds were already live. I watched on mute as Daniel stood in Emerson and Company's boardroom, chin-high, voice firm. "While we congratulate Ms. Emerson on her entrepreneurial success," he said, "we'd like to clarify that her actions are independent of this institution. Emerson and Company remains committed to traditional values and risk-controlled growth." Traditional values. The phrase tasted bitter. I wondered if he understood what that sounded like outside their echo chamber. When the camera panned to my father sitting beside him, stern and unblinking, I almost pitied him. He'd spent his life building an empire from the ground up, only to realize too late that the ground had shifted beneath him. The next few hours blurred into meetings. Our PR team fielded hundreds of calls. Investors lined up to double down. At noon, Eli closed the door behind him and leaned against my desk. "You've got every major network asking for an interview." And he hesitated again. "Your father's at reception." The words hit like a cold gust, but I didn't flinch. "Send him in." When the door opened, he entered without waiting for an invitation, his presence as commanding as ever. But beneath it, something faltered his certainty. Maybe. He scanned the room slowly, the panoramic view, the sleek furniture, the logo etched in glass behind me. For a moment, he looked like a man realizing the world had kept moving while he stood still. "Quite the operation," he said finally. "It runs itself," I replied. He didn't sit. "You've made things difficult, Catherine. For who? For everyone. For this family. For me." I folded my hands on the desk. "I didn't do this to you, Dad. I just stopped living under your ceiling." His eyes flashed. "You've humiliated us. Daniel's working overtime to manage the fallout. Clients are panicking, our stocks plummeting because of you. Our stocks falling because your business model is obsolete," I said evenly. "You ignored digital integration for a decade. This was inevitable." "You talk like a stranger," he said quietly. "Maybe because that's how you raised me, to compete to survive, but never to belong." He exhaled long and weary. "You think I don't see myself in you? You've got my drive, my precision, my control," I said. "Yes, I got that from you too, but I learned how to use it differently." He studied me a long time. "What is this then? Revenge, number, clarity?" He laughed, the sound dry as dust. "You could have come to us. We could have partnered." I shook my head. "You don't partner with people you don't respect. You delegate them." The silence stretched between us, heavy and unyielding. Finally he said, "You've built something impressive. I'll admit that. But don't mistake disruption for longevity. Flash burns fast." "Maybe," I said. "But while you've been polishing trophies, I've been building systems that outlast pride." Before he could answer, the intercom buzzed. "Ms. Emerson." My assistant's voice came through. "Mr. William Emerson. Senior is here as well. Should I send him up?" My father's shoulders stiffened. "He's here." "Yes," I said. "Send him in." A few moments later, the door opened again, and there he was. My grandfather, cane in hand, eyes bright despite his age. The last time I'd seen him was at a Christmas dinner years ago, when he'd whispered to me, "You see things they can't yet." I'd thought it was comfort then. I realize now it was prophecy. He stepped forward, gaze sweeping the office. "So this is what you've been building?" he said softly. "Elegant." "Grandpa?" My father began. "This isn't the time." He held up a hand. Quiet, Charles. You've had the floor for 30 years. The old man turned back to me. You learned well. Patience, foresight, precision. You remind me of myself before I got distracted by applause. Something inside me loosened a thread of old affection tugging free. You taught me to watch the markets, not the men who think they control them. He chuckled. And what do you see now? A storm clearing, I said. A new landscape. He nodded approvingly. And do you intend to conquer it? I smiled faintly. No. I intend to own it. My father slammed his palm on the desk. Enough! You two talk like philosophers while our name burns in headlines. Do you even care what this does to the family? Grandpa turned on him, voice sharp as a whip. The family, Charles, is fine. It's the company that's bleeding. And it's bleeding because you mistook inheritance for intelligence. My father's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Grandpa eased himself into a chair across from me. Tell me, Katie, what's next? I reached into a drawer and pulled out a slim leather folder, sliding it across the desk. A proposal. My father frowned but opened it anyway. His eyes flicked across the pages. Then they widened. A merger. A strategic one, I said. Emerson and Company folds into Novacor as a legacy division. You keep partial autonomy branding and your team under my umbrella. You stop resisting the future and start surviving in it. He looked up, incredulous. You're offering to buy us? I already could, I said, quietly. This is me choosing to save you instead. He pushed the folder away. And if we refuse, then you'll compete against technology that's already rewriting your markets, against algorithms that learn faster than your analysts, against a generation that doesn't bank the way you think they do. Grandpa leaned forward, smiling faintly. You've cornered him beautifully. I met his gaze. You always told me to study the board before making a move. I said study the quiet ones, he corrected. They see what the loud ones miss. And you did. My father stood abruptly, pacing. You've gone too far. You're talking about dismantling everything I've built. No, I said, rising too. I'm talking about evolving it. But evolution requires letting go of control. He stopped by the window, shoulders hunched. The city reflected in the glass like a verdict he didn't want to face. Your brother will never agree. He doesn't have to, I said. 3 of your biggest clients signed transition contracts this morning. They're already moving their assets to us. The board will follow. For a long moment, the room was silent, except for the faint hum of the HVAC. Then Grandpa laughed softly. Checkmate. My father turned back, his expression a strange mixture of rage and grief. You think this makes you better than us? No, I said. It makes me different from who you thought I'd be. He shook his head, voice breaking. You're my daughter. I still am, I said. But I'm also the woman you taught to never lose. You just didn't expect me to win without you. He stared at me for several seconds, then looked at the folder again, his hands trembling slightly. You'll keep the name, he asked finally. Yes, I said. Emerson stays, but it stands for something new. He sank into the chair across from me, defeated. Grandpa watched him with quiet compassion. You always said legacy mattered, the old man murmured. Well, here it is. She's your legacy. You just didn't notice while you were too busy guarding your crown. I turned toward the window, the river glinting below the skyline, alive with motion. You used to tell me, Dad, that power's about who owns the table. You were wrong. Power's about who builds the next one. He looked at me, eyes, tired pride eroding into something softer. You've made your point, he said. Send the paperwork. As he rose to leave, I added one more thing. When the announcement goes public, I want you there. The world deserves to see that even the old guard can learn humility. He hesitated, then nodded once. You've got your mother's cruelty. No, I said. Her fearlessness. He left without another word. When the door clicked shut, Grandpa exhaled deeply. You handled that well. I didn't want to destroy him, I said. I just wanted him to see me. He smiled, eyes twinkling. And now I said he'll have to. Eli stepped in a few minutes later holding a new report. Novacor stocks up another 15% after hours, he said. Emerson's down 20. Analysts are calling it the quiet revolution. I sank into my chair, exhaustion washing over me like tide water. Grandpa chuckled from his seat. The quiet ones, he said again. Always underestimated. I met his gaze. I learned from you. When he left, I sat alone for the first time all day. Outside, the city glimmered every window a flicker of ambition and survival. I thought about that dining room, the folded letter on the table, the way my mother's voice had trembled when she said, "We just want to help you fix your life." They'd tried to fix me by shrinking me, but some things don't fit back into their original shapes. I closed my eyes and let the hum of the office surround me, the sound of a future in motion. My father's world was ending. Mine was beginning. This wasn't revenge, it was restoration. Because sometimes the only way to make peace with the past is to build something it can't touch. Section 5. The Fallout 1000 Words. The morning after the merger announcement, I woke to a city that seemed to hum in my frequency. The skyline outside my penthouse window shimmered with new headlines, every glass panel of Riverfront Tower catching the dawn in silver ribbons. My phone had been vibrating since 6 a.m. Notifications mentions requests for interviews. I ignored them all. The world could wait. For the first time in a decade, I wanted silence. I made coffee black and unsweetened and stood barefoot on the cold marble, watching the news ticker scroll beneath my reflection. Legacy firm Emerson & Co. folds into Novacor Financial Systems. The crawl kept repeating each rotation, a kind of punctuation mark on the life I'd just rewritten. But beneath the thrill of victory was something heavier, something that settled between my ribs like a ghost. I had what I'd always wanted: acknowledgement, leverage, control. Yet, as the coffee cooled in my hands, I realized that none of it had filled the quiet. Success had its own kind of loneliness, one lined with gold but hollow at the core. The calls from my parents started early. I didn't answer. The first voicemail was clipped formal, my father reminding me about timing and optics. The second was softer, my mother's voice trembling slightly. "Katie, darling, we didn't mean for things to go so far. Call us back. Your father's just proud in his own way." I deleted it before she could finish. At 9, Eli came in, his energy the usual controlled storm. Every outlet wants a quote. CNN, Business Today, Forbes is already prepping your profile for the most influential under 35 issue. I nodded absently. Schedule Forbes, decline everything else for now. He studied me. "You don't look like someone who just took over half the Eastern financial market." "I don't feel like it," I admitted. "I feel untethered." He hesitated, then sat across from me. "You built this from nothing, Kate. You changed the rules. You should let yourself breathe before the next move." Breathe. The word felt foreign. For years I'd existed in forward motion, propelled by the need to prove myself. Now that the fight was over, the silence felt too large. "I'll breathe later," I said. "Right now I need to make sure it all holds." He nodded once, understanding, and left to brief the comms team. When the door shut, the loneliness returned, quiet, uninvited, familiar. I scrolled through my messages. Journalists, politicians, venture capitalists, all congratulations, all opportunists. Then one from my mother again, dinner, just the three of us. "We'd like to understand what happens next." I almost laughed. They never asked about what happened next when I was struggling. Only now, when my name had become a currency. Around noon, my grandfather called. His voice, steady as always, cut through the static. "You did well, Katie. The markets have adjusted. The analysts will come around. But remember, don't let the noise write your next chapter." "I won't," I said. "I'm just tired." "You're not tired," he replied. You're heavy with clarity. It feels like fatigue the first time you carry it. After we hung up, I stood by the window again, tracing the flow of the river below. The city looked the same as it always had, but I knew better. Every skyline hides a war. Mine just happened to be fought in numbers and names instead of blood. By afternoon, the headlines had turned from awe to analysis. Novacor's rise shakes old money foundations, tech visionary or ruthless strategist. The praise and suspicion balanced perfectly, as they always do when a woman shifts the landscape. I didn't mind. Let them debate my morality. The numbers were irrefutable. Still, I couldn't shake the hollow beat behind my sternum. That evening, I finally listened to the last voicemail from my mother. Her voice cracked midway through. "Katie, we saw your grandfather today. He's proud. Your father won't say it, but he is too. Maybe you could stop by the house. We could start over." Start over! The phrase stung more than I expected. There was no version of the past where starting over was possible. You can't rebuild a house when its foundation was arrogance. Still, part of me wanted to believe, it wanted to walk up those marble steps and find something other than performance waiting at the door. But even as that thought formed, another memory surfaced, my father's voice cold and precise, telling me I'd learned my place. He hadn't built a home. He'd built a hierarchy, and I'd dismantled it. At sunset, my grandfather arrived unannounced. He carried an old leather ledger, the one he used when I was a girl. "I thought you might want this," he said, settling into the chair across from me. The pages were filled with faded ink notes, forecasts, and calculations written in his elegant hand. "You wrote your first model in here," he said, flipping to a page near the back. My handwriting, slanted and uneven, spelled out a crude chart predicting the 2008 crash. "You were 12. You called it the storm curve. You had the sense of timing even then." I smiled faintly. "You kept it all these years." "Of course. You always saw ahead even when no one else did." He leaned forward, eyes kind but firm. "Now you're seeing further than most. Just promise me you'll remember why you started." "Because I wanted to matter," I said. "No," he corrected gently. "Because you wanted fairness. You built systems that see the overlooked. Don't let that get lost in victory." His words landed with the weight of something more than advice. They felt like inheritance, the kind that can't be measured in stock or equity. When he left, he clasped my shoulder once, a quiet benediction, and said, "You've rewritten the family story. Make sure it has a soul." After he was gone, the apartment felt larger than ever. I walked to the bookshelf and slid the ledger beside my legal binders and annual reports. For a moment, it looked out of place, too old, too personal, but maybe that was the point. Some things needed to stay human amidst the algorithms. At 9, Eli returned with updates. "Media's stabilizing. Novacor's narrative is positive overall, but Daniel's making noise again. He's calling a shareholder meeting." I turned from the window. "He's trying to rally the old guard." "Exactly. He's claiming the merger diluted their influence." I smiled faintly. "Let him try." Eli tilted his head. "You sure you don't want to get ahead of it?" "I don't chase ghosts," I said. "He's fighting a world that doesn't exist anymore." Still, after he left, I couldn't ignore the dull ache of inevitability. Daniel had always been relentless in his mediocrity. He'd never stop fighting for control, not because he wanted responsibility, but because he couldn't stand to live in a story where he wasn't the hero. Outside, thunder rolled over the horizon, low and distant. I stood at the window watching the storm creep across the water. It was almost poetic, nature rehearsing for the chaos I knew was coming. My reflection in the glass looked calm, but my pulse betrayed me. I wasn't afraid of Daniel. I was tired of what his defiance represented: the family's refusal to evolve their worship of a dying system. I turned off the lights, letting the city's glow fill the room. The river below shimmered like molten steel. In the darkness, I whispered what I didn't dare say aloud to anyone else: "You can't stop the current." The storm outside cracked open, lightning flashing over the skyline. Somewhere in the distance, I imagined Daniel making his calls, summoning allies, stirring the last embers of a legacy that was already ash. Tomorrow he'd make his move, and I would be ready. Section 6. The Countermove. 1,000 words. The morning of the shareholder meeting dawned gray and heavy, the kind of air that made even glass towers look tired. I arrived early long before the others because that's what I'd been trained to do, control the room before anyone else had the chance. The conference hall inside the renovated Emerson Tower was immaculate. Every seat lined with crisp folders, embossed with the new hybrid logo, NovaCore. Emerson Legacy Division. A symbol of the future, grafted onto the bones of the past. Daniel would hate it. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and looked out across the city. Somewhere beyond those rooftops, he was probably rehearsing his speech, the one designed to paint me as the usurper who destroyed our family's foundation. What he didn't know was that I'd already prepared for every word he'd use against me. At 10 sharp, the board began to file in, faces familiar and guarded. Men and women who had dined at our estate toasted my brother's promotions and dismissed my ambitions with practiced smiles. Their handshakes were cooler now, uncertain. The tide had shifted, but they hadn't decided whether to swim or cling to driftwood. My father arrived last, flanked by 2 senior advisors. He avoided my eyes, which was almost a kindness. The room filled with murmurs, the low hum of anticipation before the strike. Daniel entered moments later, immaculate in his tailored navy suit, the same smug composure he'd worn since prep school. He stopped near the podium, flashing me the faintest grin. "Didn't think I'd let you have the last word, did you?" I didn't answer. The moderator called the meeting to order, reminding us that this was a closed session, all proceedings confidential until board approval. Daniel launched into his speech with the confidence of a man convinced the audience had already chosen a side. "Colleagues," he began, his tone full of mock sincerity, "the events of recent weeks have been nothing short of historic. But in our pursuit of innovation, we've lost sight of stability. We've surrendered control of a century-old institution to untested algorithms, and a leadership style driven by ego, not legacy." The words landed like darts thrown at a wall already marked with holes. He gestured toward me, the practiced orator. "Our clients trusted us because we were steady, predictable, and now they're anxious. Investors are calling for reassurance that Emerson and Comby and our Emerson still stands for prudence, not reckless ambition." I watched him pace, his every move choreographed. "It's not too late," he continued. "The board can vote to amend the merger agreement to reinstate traditional oversight and return control of strategic decisions to those who built this company, not those who hijacked it." Murmurs spread across the room. I let them roll for a moment, timing my silence like a blade being sharpened. When he turned toward me with mock civility, "Kate, care to respond?" I rose slowly. My heels clicked once against the marble, and every whisper stopped. "Thank you, Daniel," I said. "You've always been consistent, even in your hypocrisy." A few nervous chuckles broke through the tension. I placed a small remote on the podium and clicked. The lights dimmed, and a massive screen behind me came alive with data charts, projections, real-time analytics. "I'd like to show you what untested algorithms have accomplished in 6 months," I said. The numbers spoke first. Revenue growth up 62%, operating costs down 35%. Client acquisition tripled. Market expansion into 2 international sectors. Then I pulled up the comparison chart, NovaCore's performance against Emerson and Comby's last decade. The disparity was brutal. "This," I said, gesturing to the left column of stagnant graphs, "is what stability bought you. Decline dressed in politeness. And this," I pointed to the right, to the sharp incline of NovaCore's line, "is what happens when innovation is given freedom instead of permission." A ripple moved through the crowd, a mixture of awe and discomfort. Daniel tried to interject, but I raised a hand. "You mentioned our clients' anxiety. Let's address that." Another click. Screens filled with testimonials, small business owners, community banks, credit unions, all speaking about the access and opportunity our AI platform had given them. Real people, not legacy accounts. While you were drafting speeches, we were rebuilding trust with those who never had it, I said. That's the real Emerson legacy service, not self-preservation. The silence that followed was heavy charged. I turned toward Daniel, whose composure was starting to crack. You said I hijacked this company, but you can't hijack something that was already sinking. You don't own survival just because you arrived first. He stepped forward, voice rising. You're destroying the very identity that made us successful. I met his gaze. No, Daniel, I'm redefining it. You confuse tradition with entitlement. The market doesn't. At my signal, Eli entered from the side doors carrying another stack of reports. Ladies and gentlemen, he said smoothly, these are the independent audits verifying every number you've just seen. Transparency was our first reform. Feel free to review them before the vote. My father cleared his throat. That won't be necessary, he said, his voice low but firm. The room turned toward him. He stood slowly, the authority in his bearing still intact despite everything. I've reviewed the data myself, he continued. And though I've disagreed with my daughter's methods, I can't deny results. Emerson has survived because of her, not in spite of her. Daniel spun toward him, stunned. You can't be serious. I'm perfectly serious, my father replied. This is not about pride anymore. It's about survival, and survival means adapting. For the first time, I saw something flicker behind my brother's eyes. Fear. The kind that comes when you realize the old guard isn't going to protect you anymore. The moderator cleared his throat. We'll proceed to the vote. The digital ballots appeared on the tablets in front of each board member. The room was silent except for the soft beeps of selections being made. I kept my eyes on the window, on the faint reflection of my own silhouette against the gray city. There was a certain poetry in letting fate unfold without interference. A minute later, the results flashed on the screen, 87% in favor of maintaining the current merger structure and leadership. 13% opposed. The outcome was decisive. Daniel's face drained of color. He looked around the table, realizing the allies he'd counted on had defected without warning. His voice came out hoarse. You'll regret this, all of you. I stood gathering the papers on the podium. Regret is the luxury of those who stay still, I said, and we're done standing still. He stormed out the doors, slamming behind him. My mother, who had been sitting near the back, dabbed at her eyes with a napkin she'd pretended was decorum. My father remained seated, gaze fixed on the screen, as though still absorbing the shift of gravity. When the moderator thanked everyone for their participation, I turned to the board. I'll expect full departmental integration within 2 weeks. The age of divisions ends today. Emerson and NovaCore aren't rivals anymore. They're one body, one heartbeat. Let's act like it. Applause began tentatively, then grew. It wasn't enthusiastic, it was relieved, the sound of people choosing certainty over chaos. But it was enough. As the room emptied, my father approached me. His voice was low, careful. You've proven your point. This was never about proving a point, I said. It was about proving a principle. He nodded slowly. Then prove one more. Don't become what you fought against. I won't, I said, meaning it, but I also won't apologize for doing what you never could. He looked at me for a long moment, then extended his hand. I shook it. For the first time, it felt like a transaction between equals. When he left, the room was quiet except for the hum of the city outside. I turned off the projector and gathered my papers, the adrenaline fading into exhaustion. I'd won again, but the victory didn't taste sharp this time. It tasted steady, clean, inevitable. I walked to the window and rested my palm against the glass. Below, traffic moved like a bloodstream, carrying the pulse of something I'd built from nothing. The storm clouds had begun to thin streaks of pale sunlight cutting through. I watched them spread slow and certain and whispered to my reflection, respect isn't inherited. It's earned. and for the first time, the city seemed to whisper it back. Section 7. The Restoration. 1,000 words. Weeks passed and the storm began to quiet. The news cycle shifted from analysis to admiration, and for the first time my name wasn't paired with scandal, it was paired with results. Emerson Tower. Transformed under Novacore leadership. Tech modernization breathes new life into a legacy giant. Every article felt like a soft drumbeat of validation, steady and deserved. Still, I didn't allow myself to bask in it. Success, I'd learned, isn't a finish line, it's maintenance. The real work began after the applause. The first morning I walked through the newly rebranded Emerson Tower, I almost didn't recognize it. The walls that once held oil portraits of solemn patriarchs now displayed digital art and data visualizations of our impact microloans, funded startups, supported communities connected. The hush of elitism had been replaced with the low hum of innovation. You could hear collaboration in the air like a frequency. I passed interns in sneakers and analysts discussing algorithmic fairness by the espresso machine. They didn't look afraid of failure here. They looked alive. Eli caught up with me in the hallway, tablet in hand. "Integration's complete," he said. "Every legacy system is running on Nova Core architecture." And he hesitated, smiling slightly. "Profits have doubled this quarter." I nodded, the corner of my mouth lifting. "That's good. But the real metric is access. How many small institutions have joined the platform? 32 this week alone. It's spreading faster than we projected." I exhaled, the relief quiet but deep. "Then it's working." He studied me for a moment. "You don't celebrate much, do you?" "I'm saving it for when the system doesn't just grow," I said. "When it sustains." He smiled knowingly. "That's why it does." By noon, I was standing in what used to be my father's private office, a corner room that once smelled of cigars and restraint. We'd converted it into an open mentorship hub, glass walls filled with light and energy. I watched a young woman from Georgia Tech present her first project to a small group of new hires. Her voice trembled at first but strengthened as she went on. The data on her screen wasn't just clean, it was original. I felt something tighten in my chest, a recognition of the hunger that used to live in me. After her presentation, I approached her. "You did well," I said. She flushed. "Thank you, Ms. Emerson. I just didn't think I'd ever have a chance to be here. My last internship wouldn't even let me pitch an idea. Here, ideas are currency," I told her. "Spend freely." Her smile was shy but bright. I walked away thinking that maybe this was what legacy should feel like, not marble halls or brand names, but access granted to those who'd been told to wait outside. Later that day, I found my mother in the renovated lobby pretending to admire the new sculpture installation while avoiding the cameras. She turned when she saw me, her smile nervous. "It's beautiful, darling. You've done wonders with the place." I stood beside her watching the reflection of the glass atrium shimmer in the polished floor. "It's different," I said. "It is," she admitted. "But better, lighter." She hesitated, then added, "Your father's adjusting." Slowly. I could hear the hope in her voice, fragile and familiar. "He'll come around?" I said. She looked up at me, her eyes softer than I remembered. "You remind me of your grandfather," she said. "He used to talk about the future like it was a friend he hadn't met yet." I never understood that until now. There was no bitterness in her tone this time, only something close to pride. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the urge to defend myself. "Thank you," I said simply. That night, I met my father for dinner at the same country club that once refused to acknowledge my achievements. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. He was waiting at the bar, posture straight, expression guarded. "You didn't have to come," he said when I arrived. "I wanted to," I replied. "We should talk." He nodded, motioning for a waiter. You're changing things faster than I expected. Change doesn't ask for permission, I said. He smiled faintly. I suppose not. For a while, we just sat there in silence, the clinking of silverware filling the space where accusation used to live. Then, in a voice stripped of all the bravado I'd grown up with, he said, "You were right. About everything. I thought leadership meant preservation, not evolution. I was wrong." The words landed with the weight of an overdue apology. I didn't need him to say he was sorry, this was better. "You built the foundation," I said. "I just expanded the frame." He studied me carefully. "Daniel's taking a break. Says he needs time to recalibrate." "Good," I said. "He'll learn more outside the echo chamber." He chuckled quietly. "You sound like your grandfather." When dinner ended, he extended his hand, but this time when I took it, it wasn't a business formality. It was human. We left the club together, the night air heavy with the scent of jasmine and salt. For once, I didn't feel like I was leaving something behind. Back at the tower, Eli was waiting in my office with a stack of onboarding forms. "We're launching the mentorship program officially next week," he said. "You sure you want to handle the first session yourself?" "Yes," I said. "If I'm going to preach inclusion, I should be the one to open the door." He grinned. "I'll make sure the press gets wind of it. They'll love the optics." "It's not about optics," I said. "It's about repair." The following week, I stood before 50 new recruits, students, career changers, veterans, each one carrying the same flicker of hope I once buried under doubt. I told them what no one ever told me. You don't need to ask for permission to build, you just need to start. Their applause was quiet, but it filled me more than any headline ever had. When the day ended, I lingered by the window overlooking the river. Savannah glowed beneath a lavender dusk, the city lights stretching toward the horizon like a promise. My mother had stopped planning charity galas and instead joined one of our community funding initiatives. My father spent his afternoons consulting with small-town banks, guiding them into the digital age. And Daniel, he'd finally reached out an email this time, short but sincere. I was wrong. "I'd like to help if you'll let me." When he visited a week later, he looked different, less polished, more real. "I've been reviewing the AI platform," he said quietly. "It's brilliant. I didn't understand what you were building." "You never tried," I said, though not unkindly. He nodded. "I know. I'm sorry." I studied him for a long moment. "The junior analyst position is open," I said. "You want it?" His eyes widened. "You'd trust me with that." "Trust is earned," I said. "Like success. Ready to earn both." He smiled for the first time in years. "Yes." When he left, I felt something unexpected settle inside me, peace. The family I'd fought to break free from was slowly learning to rebuild itself not as a hierarchy, but as a circle. That night I hung the last frame in my office, my grandfather's old ledger, beside a photo of my team on launch day. Beneath it, I placed the engraved plaque that read, "Legacy through Innovation." For the first time, the words didn't feel contradictory. They felt complete. Section 8. The Reflection. 1,000 words. The city always looks different before sunrise. From the top floor of Novacor Tower, Savannah was a sea of quiet gold and muted blue, the river below moving slow and certain, like time itself had decided to catch its breath. I stood at the window, coffee in hand, barefoot, watching the first light creep across the water. The office behind me was still no noise, no chatter, no screens flashing with data, just the steady hum of the servers 2 floors down, keeping the empire alive while I finally let myself stop running. For months, my life had been momentum, meetings, strategy, defense growth. But in the stillness of this hour, I could see the arc of the story clearly, from exile to evolution, from silence to sovereignty. The world saw a merger. The media saw dominance. But I saw something smaller, more human, a restoration of balance. My family hadn't been destroyed. It had been recalibrated. My father still visited once a week, usually to argue about policy, and then quietly stay for coffee. My mother had started mentoring women entrepreneurs in her social circle, rediscovering purpose in a world that once only valued appearances. And Daniel surprisingly had flourished in his new role. He came in early, left late, and spoke less, but listened more. Watching him grow was strange and strangely beautiful, like seeing a version of him that could have existed if we'd both been allowed to fail without ridicule. I turned from the window and looked around my office. The walls were lined with the symbols of every phase of this journey. The framed Forbes cover the ledger from my grandfather, the minimalist white blouse that had become a quiet icon of defiance. It hung in a glass frame, simple and unadorned, the same way it looked the day my mother criticized it for not being polished enough. It wasn't nostalgia that made me keep it, it was memory made tangible, a reminder that power doesn't always arrive in noise or flash. Sometimes it arrives clothed in understatement, built from patience, from nights spent believing in something no one else could see. Eli entered quietly, holding a tablet and a knowing look. "You're early," he said. "I never really sleep after big milestones," I admitted. "Another one today. Maybe the last of the firsts," I said, smiling faintly. "The new HQ ribbon cutting. You ready?" He nodded. "Press is already setting up outside. They want you to give a quote about legacy again." I laughed under my breath. They love that word, legacy, as if it's a family heirloom instead of something you have to earn every day. Eli handed me the tablet. "Then maybe you should define it for them." The image on the screen showed our new outreach center, a partnership between NovaCore and regional colleges designed to teach financial literacy and tech skills in rural communities. Students in thrift store suits and borrowed blazers smiled in front of the banner, "Access is power." It wasn't a press stunt. It was the purpose behind the platform. The data, the mergers, the valuations, those were just the mechanics. This was the meaning. When Eli left, I sat at my desk and opened my grandfather's ledger to the first page. His handwriting filled it neat and deliberate. "Compound interest is the reward of patience." Underneath it, in my own child's scrawl, were the words. I'd added years later, "Patience doesn't mean waiting. It means building while you wait." That was the through line of my life, wasn't it? I built while they doubted. I worked while they dismissed. And when the moment came, I didn't need to shout. The work spoke for itself. At 7, I walked through the building one last time before the event began. The hallways buzzed with quiet preparation, assistants arranging chairs, engineers fine-tuning the digital displays, a few interns nervously comparing notes. Every face I passed carried the same spark, the belief that they belonged here, that effort was currency, and opportunity wasn't inherited but created. That was the part I was proudest of. Not the billions or the headlines, but the culture we'd built. A place where people didn't have to fight for the right to be heard. When I reached the lobby, my father was already there, straightening his tie as though the act might restore some control. He looked up when he saw me. "Big day," he said. "It is," I replied. "Thank you for coming." He nodded, his expression unreadable, then said quietly, "Your grandfather would have been proud." He already told me, I said, "But thank you." He smiled just barely, and for the first time I could remember it wasn't forced. "You were right about one thing," he added. "Power doesn't stay with those who guard it. It moves to those who build something new." "Then maybe there's hope for the rest of us," I said. The ceremony was brief but elegant. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered, the board clapped on cue. I gave the speech I'd written at 2 in the morning, simple and deliberate. Innovation. I told them isn't rebellion, it's respect. Respect for the future, for those who come after us, for the idea that progress doesn't erase history, it refines it. When the applause faded, I didn't feel triumph. I felt calm, a deep, steady calm that came from knowing the story had reached balance. Afterward, I slipped away to the rooftop terrace, needing one last moment of solitude. The air was cool and the city stretched below like an open book. From up here, the river gleamed like a vein of silver connecting past to future in a single, unbroken line. I leaned against the railing, the wind pulling at my hair, and whispered the truth that had carried me through every fight, every humiliation, every win. They thought success was loud. But power doesn't shout, it hums. I stayed there until the crowd below thinned, until the sound of my name faded into the distance. When I finally went back inside, the office was dim and quiet again. I paused by the framed blouse one more time and smiled. "You did good," I murmured to the reflection in the glass. "We did good." Before leaving, I switched off the lights and took one last look at the skyline. The city glowed endless and alive, every window, a small story unfolding, some of a struggle, some of triumph. I thought about all the people building quietly in their own corners, unseen, but unstoppable. Those were my people, the builders, the patient ones. They wrote me out of their story, I said softly, watching the horizon blush with light. So I built my own. Outside, the morning broke fully open, the river blazing with gold, the city awakening to its next chapter. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was proving anything. I was simply living the proof. Section 9, YouTube video. Outro 72. Words. As Kate Emerson's story comes to a close, she finally exhales, no longer fighting to be seen, but choosing how to be remembered. If this story of quiet power and transformation spoke to you, hit subscribe and share your thoughts below. We read every single comment of your reflections and experiences. Your voice keeps these stories alive. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.